This is Redraft in 5 with Theo Gremminger and Andrew Cooper, and we're talking waiver wire heading into week 2. This is always a fruitful week historically, but we don't have like that low-hanging guy like a Puka Nacua this year. We're gonna have to do a little bit of work here, but Coop and I got you covered. We're gonna talk about shallow leagues, standard leagues, and we're also gonna give you some deep league options that'll be available for anybody watching this show right now. Coop, I'm gonna kick it to you. Who are some shallow league players that need to be rostered everywhere?
Yeah, so I was combing around, and the shallow league players, they play on sites like Sleeper, Yahoo, ESPN, right? So I'm looking at guys that are around 50% owned, 40, sometimes even down to 30, but a lot of leagues 50% owned. You got to grab Rashid Shaheed if he's out there, J.K. Dobbins if he's out there, and Brandin Cooks. And I'm talking potentially your top waiver priority if you play that way, or a decent chunk of fab, especially if they go right in your lineup.
I think that everybody's going to say, that's Coop, I completely agree with you. Shaheed's a no-brainer ad. Usage backs it up. And J.K. Dobbins, no-brainer ad. He's going to be ranked as an RB2 everywhere this week. But the one I'd like you to elaborate on is Brandin Cooks. Are you viewing this as he is going to get a significant amount of the Jake Ferguson targets, and it's going to be more wide receiver centric in Dallas?
Bingo, man. Bingo. That's what it is. I mean, because the reality is Brandin Cooks wasn't healthy for huge chunks of last year. He was hurt right from the start of the season. He even did have a couple monster games there, a game with 140 yards. And yesterday he came out and played the entire game opposite of CeeDee Lamb. In fact, he actually played more snaps and ran more routes than CeeDee Lamb. Jalen Tolbert is the third fiddle. Guys like Jalen Brooks didn't even really play much. And now that Jake Ferguson, we know he's going to miss some time with the MCL. This guy is at the top of my streamers list. Like, if you need someone to play for you right now, especially while Ferg is out with the knee, throw him right in there, because I just don't see how this offense can operate without at least 2 pass catchers that are on a 100-plus target pace. And if Ferg's not going to be out there, then it's Cooks and who? You know what I mean? It's Lamb, it's Cooks, these running backs or whatever. I think he's actually a pretty solid player, man. And the upside's there because he's still got that speed. But the speed is still there. Maybe he's not as fast as he once was, but part of the speed that he offered before, just like 75, 80%, is still faster than a lot of guys. So Cooks can definitely still hit the home run.
I really like that one. And Brandin Cooks is super interesting because we talked about Jalen Tolbert on a show before, Coop, as a guy that had a lot of buzz this summer. Maybe that we see a year 3 bounce. Last year, Brandin Cooks was a little bit disappointing. But at the end of the day, they had a whole summer to plan for it. Tolbert caught 1 pass. That's just not going to happen. It's going to be consolidated between, you're going to see a ton of CeeDee Lamb. You're going to see a lot of Brandin Cooks. And we're going to talk about maybe some tight end options a little bit later. Let's talk about standard leagues, because I think we're talking to most people when we talk about these leagues, Coop.
Right, yeah.
And I got 2 guys that I think everybody's going to want to add. Isaiah Likely is available in 72% of Yahoo leagues. I think this is almost a no-brainer. Anybody who watched the game, the guy was just incredible. Ends up with 12 targets, 10 catches, almost had 2 touchdown grabs, and Lamar Jackson was just looking for him right and left. And I think one thing that's interesting is, even if we're going to anticipate a Mark Andrews bounce back, Isaiah Likely is essentially operating as their wide receiver 2 usage-wise. So it's Zay Flowers, it's Isaiah Likely, it's Mark Andrews, and they were in 12 personnel a ton. Anything to add on Likely? This is I think a really, really good player. And finally, we have an offensive coordinator. It's like, I'm going to keep him on the field a lot.
Yeah, and with Mark Andrews, we're hoping that he's just rusty because he didn't really practice much with the car accident. But you have to keep in mind that he had the tightrope surgery for the high ankle injury last year. And we've seen guys like that surgery lets you come back quickly and play right away, but there's a downside to it, that the recovery to get back to 100% takes a long time. Tony Pollard last year had the surgery, and he said that he wasn't good to go and feeling 100% until week 11. So we're hoping that it's just rust for Mark Andrews, but if he's in that kind of long-term recovery from that injury, I mean, it could be a while until we see him being himself. And at the very least, I think Isaiah Likely did enough that it's no longer just Flowers and Mark Andrews is the only 2 focal points. At the very least, it's now a 3-headed monster. And in an offense like the Ravens, that could be good enough to start in a lot of lineups, especially at your tight end premium.
Yeah, an obvious ad. And I'll say Bucky Irving might be a little bit under the radar here for some, but Coop, like, Bucky Irving's a guy that we were drafting a lot this summer as a contingent upside guy. And I made an argument that Bucky Irving could be a handcuff plus. I think it's going to start cutting into a 50-50 timeshare. Rachaad White is not dusty by all means. He's still out-targeted Bucky Irving 6-3, but efficient running and explosive running in that offense, it's Bucky Irving. Bucky Irving looks really, really, really strong as a runner. This coaching staff loves him. They praise him continually. And we don't really have any concerns about Bucky Irving in terms of his pass catching ability. He led the nation in running back receptions last year at Oregon. And you're talking about a player where if Rachaad White were to miss time, with how efficient Bucky Irving is in this offense and his pass catching upside, you're talking about a guy who could win league, like immediately give you 15-point per game production in the Bucs offense. I'm like over the top with Bucky Irving right now. I think he's a must-add and a guy that I would certainly prioritize in as many leagues as possible if he's available on the waiver wire.
Yeah, not to mention, right before the season started, the coach came out and said, the last thing that you want to hear when you took the first back in the backfield, he said that, he goes, obviously you go with the hot hand, which to a lot of fantasy gamers out there, we said, what? That's not something that most coaches say. Like most coaches say, they don't say that. They just use the starter, right? Like Kyle Shanahan at one point was that hot hand guy before they got Christian McCaffrey. And you know what happens in that case. That comment is always better if you're the person that has the backup. It's never what you want to hear if you have the starter. And especially if week 1, the backup comes out and runs for what, like 8 yards a carry, and the starter comes out and runs for like 2. Like, if you want to talk about the hot hand, Bucky Irving's got the hot hand right now.
Rachaad White, by all accounts, is a guy who's very good at catching the football out of the backfield. He's had back-to-back 50-plus reception seasons. And Rachaad White last year, massive ADP success story. Again, he's not going to disappear. But Bucky Irving, I think this could become a little bit more of a 50-50 backfield where both of these guys are getting enough touches that you could start them. You're not going to be super excited to start Rachaad White if he starts conceding more carries to Bucky Irving. But you are going to be excited about having Bucky Irving as a possible flex player where you got him in your drafts. And I think you need to prioritize him on the waiver wire. We want as many sort of lottery ticket guys as possible. And Bucky Irving is a lottery ticket that also gives us a weekly floor. This guy is just good at football, and it's hard to put this back in the bag. I love Bucky Irving. Coop, let's talk about some of these deep league options. And one player that I actually wrote about, I'm going to flex it. I wrote about him in my preseason waiver wire column that dropped last week on PlayerProfiler. And if you want to check out our waiver wire advice in further detail, you can find mine at PlayerProfiler and Coop's over at Fantasy Alarm. But I wrote about Devon Vele, and I had like a couple of DMs where people are like, what are you doing? And I'm like, Devon Vele has a path, man. And Josh Reynolds and Devon Vele both had 8 targets this past week. But Vele's the guy. He's a big slot, super old, Coop. But I'll give a mental exercise. If Marvin Mims or Troy Franklin had 8 targets last week, how would drafters be treating them off of the waiver wire? That's sort of where we're at. Vele is well ahead of those two kind of well-known names. And his game seems to kind of correlate and mesh well with Bo Nix. What are you thinking with Vele?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is with Sean Payton, like he often, as much coach speak as he and everyone else has, he often will allude to things that he actually does, right? Like, so for him, he's been all over this guy, Devon Vele. He's been even injured. That's the biggest thing for me is that Vele missed a huge chunk of the preseason at a crucial time, and they still got him in there. It's kind of like the Tucker Kraft situation. The fact that Tucker Kraft missed so much offseason and still played over Luke Musgrave, that speaks volumes. So if Devon Vele is going to miss that much time, but he showed enough already that he is a flat-out focal point of the offense this week, then there's fire where the smoke once was, right? Like, so for me, if he's going to come out and get 8 targets and catch all 8 of them, which is a nice little bonus, right? Dude, you got to be looking for those guys, man, because we spent so much time last year saying Puka Nacua is not going to be anything, whatever, until eventually we had to admit that he was. So Devon Vele, it's time to start suggesting that maybe he is something.
Yeah, and I think that you made a great point, like, and we're not expecting Puka Nacua, but I'll also bring up people were a little bit dismissive of adding Tank Dell. Tank Dell was a 3rd-round draft pick. Yeah. Josh Downs, had a number of games last year. Vele is obviously a day 3 guy, but at the end of the day, they trust him and they're using him in the slot. So Vele is a guy that I'm going to be putting bids on in several leagues, and I already have a little bit. So I just want to see kind of where this situation goes. Cortland Sutton had a 28% target share, but after that, they need receivers. I'll kick it to you after this. I'll say that 2 deep league ads, especially for tight end premium, that I currently have as my waiver wire bids, 2 guys I'm looking to add to a few rosters, are two contingent plays here. Jordan Akins is the next man in for David Njoku, and Luke Schoonmaker, last year's second-round pick out of Michigan for the Dallas Cowboys, is going to be in for Jake Ferguson. Which of these two interests you the most, Coop?
Yeah, so in those deep leagues, it depends how your team is built and how you're living. If you need someone to start for you right away, let's say you went crazy thin and you need someone to actually go into your lineup, it probably has to be Jordan Akins, right? Because he is kind of the only show in town. When Njoku left, he just took over the whole job himself, and that could be the case. If you have somebody else that's a contingent play, and I hope you do, especially in some of these deeper leagues, then it is probably Luke Schoonmaker that has the higher upside, right? He was splitting with Brevin Spanford, but you and I both know that Brevin Spanford is more of an extra offensive lineman than he is a pass catcher, right? So we expect Schoonmaker to take over those pass catching duties. And on both those teams, I mean, there's a path to targets. We talked about Brandin Cooks, but I mean, like, what if he does pick up those targets there? So that's kind of how we're operating. And just a quick overview just of the yin and yang tight end strategy and what we're doing. If you're really scrambling at tight end, let's say you lost Jake Ferguson or you lost Njoku, the yin and yang tight end philosophy is to use a yin as your safe guy that you can start for the time being, and then yang is your upside bench play. So for me, in your shallower leagues, if you can get a Zach Ertz or you can get a Colby Parkinson with Puka Nacua now banged up, those are guys that are safer. Whereas Jordan Akins in the deeper league would be that. Like, if you're completely panicking, we at least think he's going to play. On the Yang side, that's where I'm still stashing guys like Hunter Henry, who had decent deployment but didn't really get targeted. Hayden Hurst, who ran far more routes than Will Disley. Maybe even Greg Dulcich, to see if they figure out something with him. And then that's where you would put your Luke Schoonmaker, where it's like, okay, he was splitting snaps this past week when Ferg was out. If they split snaps, then it's a nightmare because you can't have a tight end rotation and expect anything. But he's got the athleticism. Obviously, Jordan Akins is an older journeyman. So if you're looking for an upside play, that's the way to go.
I'll agree with you on that. I think Ertz and especially Hunter Henry, you also want to keep an eye on guys with frustration cuts this week. Like, we don't need to tell you, like, if somebody in your league cuts Jalen Wright, pick him up. If somebody in your league cuts one of these tight ends that can be useful to you, like Zach Ertz is on the field a ton. He's way ahead of Ben Sinnott right now. And Hunter Henry was a guy that, like Coop talked about on our previous episodes that we've recorded, has a pathway to continually being one of the target leaders week in, week out in New England. So I'm completely with you on that. If you like this video, hit the like button and make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We're going to be dropping episodes like this every single week that are going to help you win in fantasy. We'll be back soon.